Welcome to AWonderJunkie podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Anderson.
Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
Today I had a conversation with Catherine Liu, who I heard first on Brian James' podcast, and I also had Brian on the podcast. He wrote a book called Traumadelic, and Catherine's in her second book right now. It's almost out, called Traumatized. I find this subject fascinating. It's about trauma culture and some of the implications that are there when we start to focus on the individual and trauma. Catherine and I disagree about a lot of different things, which I think is important to have conversations with people that do not think like us and to be able to hold different perspectives. And especially in our culture now where we're seeing a lot more division and people are more tribal and they're becoming more stuck in these different ways of thinking without being able to hear the other side. So I would like to encourage you to just listen with an open mind and take on some new perspectives, and if you don't agree, that's great. I think it's important to look at different people's perspectives with an objective mind instead of it being something that offends you or triggers you. So either way, enjoy this episode, and don't forget to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube, and share the episode. Enjoy. All right, Catherine, thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Ryan.
Yeah, I listened to your podcast with Brian James, who I've had on this show, and I really enjoyed talking with him and exploring some of his ideas. And I really enjoyed your guys' conversation, which then led me to reading one of your blog posts, I guess you could call it, about trauma culture. And I think the title was The Problem with Trauma Culture. I ended up reading that twice, and it was really enjoyable. And I thought more people are starting to come forth with some of these ideas, but you've been obviously spending quite a bit of time putting them in order and hacking them out. And I want to explore that with you today, if you're cool with that.
Sure. I have a book coming out next spring with Verso called Traumatized, which is a critique of trauma culture.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I feel like there's a lot of people that are starting to resonate with a lot of what you two are both saying, and there's some other folks coming forth too. And so I'm curious, what the heck got you here where you're spending all of your hours trying to write a book like that, because that takes a lot of energy and passion and stuff. So obviously there's some roots there.
Well, I'm in revision, so the big heavy lifting part is over, I think. But here's what brought me here. I was kind of in the ground zero at Yale when trauma studies was invented. And I was really interested in psychoanalysis, and without putting too fine a point on it, I was a pretty traumatized kid at that time. So, like, something about these courses about trauma and psychoanalysis resonated with me, and there were these two very famous, one famous professor, Shoshana Fellman, and Kathy Caruth was an up-and-coming young woman who was teaching these courses at the time, and I was really into it at first, and then when I finished taking their courses, I kind of walked away from it. And it took me years of processing, like 40 years of processing what that was about. And also, it seemed to me that it was just very much in the air at the time. It was the 1980s. And it became something very important for people in academia who are doing deconstruction and psychoanalysis to deal with. Tell me if this is like too in the weeds, okay?
No way. I'm enjoying it, so go for it.
So in Doom Scroll on Joshua Sidorilla's interview with me, I went into detail about this. I don't really talk about the autobiographical stuff in the book, but what was happening was that it was so much part of popular discourse, and I was trying to find ways of connecting my own experiences. Now they call it, immigrant trauma, intergenerational trauma, whatever, to what was happening in the world. And one of the things that people were able to talk about as a kind of indication of how enlightened we were was trauma, right? Through the psychoanalytic lens. And this was the end of the Cold War. So human rights discourse was coming up. Um, second wave feminism was talking about sexual abuse and post-traumatic stress, had moved from just being something that men experienced after war because of the Vietnam vet movement to bring PTSD into the discourse. And Judith Herman had just written her book Trauma and Recovery. Like, I wasn't really aware of all of this stuff, but it offered like a facile way to enter into public discussions about private suffering. And feminism was always about the personal becomes the political. Looking back on it now, at the end of the Cold War, it was really a way for liberals and people like deconstructive feminists and psychoanalysts to deal with suffering without having to deal with class. And it was and Ronald Reagan was in power then. And, I was into, just the understanding what it was to publicly or, academically talk about this kind of stuff. And it became very focused on, in trauma studies, the Holocaust and how you couldn't speak about so many people who survived, had so much difficulty speaking about the event. And they were and these women, these scholars, most of them women at the time, were talking about these things that were about fragmentation and repression and PTSD and all this other stuff. And I was probably going through a version of this myself with regard to my family, but it allowed me to intellectualize what was happening. But looking at this now, looking back at it now, it was really a great way to individualize suffering and to not talk about social or political consequences, but also to make America an American discourse, because this was all coming out of America, the most enlightened, the most liberal thing. Because when the wall fell and when communism was falling, this discourse went way through the roof. Like, I had a research assistant do a LexisNexis study of the incidence of the word trauma in public discourse in like major magazines in 1970, zero. And it goes kind of like this. And then about 80, 88, 85, it goes like this. And then after 9/11, it goes like way up. And one of the things that these people talked about, from Oprah to my professors at Yale, was if we can talk more openly about our private suffering and our traumatic past, we make a better society. Well, at the same time that you have trauma going like this, you have inequality going like this. You have wages going like this. You have job growth in the center of the country going like this. You have working class life expectancy going like this. So I'm not saying it's correlated or causative, but I'm just saying all the promises of like these celebrities and academics talking about trauma did not make America a better country or a better place for the majority of Americans who are non-college educated working class people. So in a way, that's like the background to all of this stuff. But I also think that it took a lot of trauma culture takes minority experiences and makes them have to represent suffering for liberal consumption. So you can tell certain stories as a person of color if you engage in the trauma discourse, in the trauma culture discourse. And this was also like the beginning of a really powerful move towards identity politics. And it was a way for the institutions to assimilate the promises of the civil rights and women's movement without doing any kind of economic redistribution or analysis, and just giving everyone like symbolic kudos, like, oh, we see you, we see you. And it still goes on today. And
it's fascinating.
this is, I don't know if you've read Virtue Hoarders, but this class, the professional managerial class that I'm a part of, that therapists are a part of, that the media elites are part of, really are the greatest proponents of understanding suffering and damage completely in this individualized way. And since that time, since like the 80s, the self-help trauma recovery movement, because you have to have your promised recovery, like Judith Herman's book is called Trauma and Recovery. Everyone's like looking for a solution. It's like a multi-billion dollar, like $500 billion industry, because people are searching for solutions. We don't have good health care. We don't have good mental health coverage. The way that mental health practitioners are being trained is awful. The insurance companies are rationing mental health care, and we have a mental health crisis. And so people are looking everywhere, online, Instagram, whatever, looking for, influencers who will tell them, like, do EMDR, do CBT, um, behavioral modification therapies. And Americans are like hungry for purchasable solutions, because a lot of these promises, well, I have some of the books here. There's a book on my bookshelf called The End of Trauma. They're promising that they can like eliminate your PTSD, these doctors.
Right. And then it becomes an interesting, there's an incentive to market and tally up how much trauma you have as like a virtuous component, right? And I've heard you speak to that, and I've seen it myself, to where if you're not doing the work, or you're not trying to do the healing, or you're not trauma informed, you're not welcome to the conversation. And it seems to obviously be only in these certain categories of folks that have already met the hierarchical of needs. They've got the food, shelter, water. Now they have time, and it becomes a self-absorbed, self-obsessed movement, from workshop to workshop, from event to event, from book to book. And I think
Yeah.
that's the component, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
No.
Because I've read a lot of books as a fireman for 20 years. I'm like, okay, what's going on here? What's the root of suffering? What's the nature of addiction? And I've come across some things that are awesome inside of those things. You
Yes.
take nuggets
Yes.
from it. And you don't want to say that trauma is not real or be incompassionate.
No.
And that's
No.
not what you're doing. But even Peter Levine, I have him coming on in a week, and I'm excited to talk to him, because he's come up with some ideas about somatic and elements like that, about the body keeps the score and doing somatic practice, and it's all there. But
Yeah.
at,
Yeah.
at what point do we just keep healing forever and not go back to work, or not go back to culture, or not have a bigger, larger perspective that has to do with, well,
Yeah.
the culture's sick, and
Yeah.
why should we feel good when our culture's going off the rails? And so let's
Yeah.
get into a little bit more of that, because you have a lot to say here, and I'd like to extract as much as I can while we have you.
Um, so I don't know who your audience are, firefighters too, or just
Not
or
really. I have a very
cyclists.
wide spectrum, because I'm a bit of a wonder junkie. So I learn about everything, and I interview physicists to
Oh, that's
people that are
right.
into
That's right.
movement and health, and you can name it. So it's really a wide spectrum audience.
So I feel like a lot of the scientific discoveries around trauma really occurred during the beginning of the 20th century, when people really under when people they were studying World War I veterans. And actually Sigmund Freud was one of the people who was reading these case studies, and they had these men who were paralyzed. Often they were unable to go back to the front. And the reason, whenever anyone wants to invest a lot of money in trauma in a government, it's because they want to rehabilitate soldiers to put them back in the front. And what he had, what people were remarking about, and was that these men would have dreams where they were repeatedly reliving the trench warfare experiences. And Freud first came up with this idea that um, one of the things about a really traumatic event, which breaks our boundaries and our narcissism about, being intact people, is that it is a shock, right? It is just it rips you apart. And
Mm,
then what you do afterwards, as part of trying to recover from it when you're on your own, is you repeat the trauma, either through dreams or through finding yourself in equally bad situations or relationships, or whatever. We all know what that's like now. And he says this is part of the neurosis that trauma produces because we're repeating it so that we can master it again.
Mm.
And we can create this like hyper vigilant state so that instead of being shocked by this thing that blows up our world and our bodies, here's the thing that he discovered was that men who had been wounded physically, who had a physical wound on their bodies, had less trauma, less neurotic repetition because the wound was visible and they could heal. It was
Mm.
the people it was the people who experienced shell shock, just being like shocked in the trenches without having bodily harm done. They were the ones who were suffering from the most severe forms of what they called then shell shock. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the unsympathetic doctors were like, they're just pretenders, they're malingering, there's nothing wrong with them physically, they just don't want to go back to the front. And Freud's analysis of this was that the repetition compulsion was a
Mm.
part of trying to master this situation that just like blows all of your boundaries aside. And then,
Mm-hmm.
but each person has a different trajectory to reconstituting their egos. There's no singular formula because depending on what your childhood was like, if a bomb blows up next to your ear, you're going to somatize that differently than a bomb blowing up next to my ear. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for me, it'd probably be like, I deserve this. My parents, told me I wasn't worthy, whatever. And then it becomes like part of my fantasy that I can rationalize it, like I deserve this, or I'm just attached to it. I don't even have the words for it. I'm just hyper vigilant all the time. You can see this in a lot of traumatized people,
Mm-hmm.
who women who go from bad relationship to bad relationship, or men who go from bad relationship to bad relationship, or people who can't constitute any kind of stability because the adrenaline just keeps running. In your line of work, I think this is probably really profound. It's like you just become an adrenaline junkie because you think like, if I just have my adrenaline up at the right time, then I'll be able to protect myself from this like inconceivably horrible thing that could
Mm.
happen.
Mm-hmm.
So it was all about the reconstitution of the soldier's psyche to send them back to the front. That really the study of trauma, begins in the 20th century, and there were a lot of effective treatments of the traumatized soldier. They weren't. It wasn't very specialized. Um, in World War One, they found that if they put the hospitals next to the front, and if you suffered shell shock and you went right into the hospital and they treated you kindly,
Mm.
you would heal better so that you could go out and fight again. But if you were sent home, or you didn't have treatment right away and people told you were just malingering, then those soldiers really, really suffered for a long time. So the feminist focus on sexual abuse and sexual trauma that was engineered by Judith Herman comes out of the Vietnam War veterans thing, and she was saying, the psychiatrists were so sexist against women, and they were like, oh, they're just hysterical, or they're just crazy, and so she saw that a lot of these women that male psychiatrists had dismissed as being just crazy, or involved in relationships that they couldn't get out of, were actually suffering from a form of PTSD that comes out of sexual abuse, um, or just mental abuse in their relationships. So there's this real focus on trauma and healing and recovery, and she works in a clinic in Boston. But you know what? These women, like in the form of Hillary Clinton and these PMC feminists, who's second wave feminists, who are white collar workers, very elite white collar workers, if they really cared about women's health and women's mental health, you know what they would all be fighting for? Single payer healthcare.
Mm.
Because if we had transportable healthcare, then women would not be dependent on men for their health care. And you could access mental health care without having to worry about whether or not your insurance could cover it.
Mm.
So the just to stay within the psychic world without looking at the larger political structures of what they want to call patriarchy is, I think, one of the biggest mistakes of professional managerial class feminism. And it's not a mistake for them because their class interests are at stake here. But when you look at like working class women and poor women and their and dependency on a male provider, this is, well, I think actually, like, working for really poor women, there's Medicare, right? And the marriage thing doesn't function as well. It's actually lower middle class women who are trapped in these relationships with men who have the healthcare. Right now, we don't have any healthcare for any good healthcare for anyone. But like, let's say in the 60s, 70s, still were 80s, where there was still stable male employment, you could like, yap on about patriarchy, or you could have been working for, nationalized healthcare. But
Hmm.
I was just really interested in this moment when a lot of the promises of the counterculture in the 60s get institutionalized without the economic critique side of things. And so
Hmm.
um, my book is very polemical about that, but it's also, because I really believe that, like, we have to understand ourselves in social and economic contexts. It's really, we're not isolated monadic individuals who are having horrible experiences in vacuums.
Right. It's hard not to always look at other cultures too and how they relate to their environment and their upbringing and how people look at trauma differently or don't even use that word. Some of
Right.
them have a different meaning towards it and it creates a whole different outcome. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about Palestinian studies that I heard you mention and what the outcomes were with that. And then also, we'll get into like the 1960s and we'll get into Vietnam and the DSM and the creation of that whole incentivization structure because that's fascinating. So let's start
Um,
with those two if you want.
so there's a Lancet study that I found when I was doing the research on the trauma book that showed that, and it was done in the 90s. So it was like the first Intifada, and or just they were looking at children who had survived, warfare or loss of parents, and the Palestinian children were not showing signs of the classic signs of trauma because they had a really strong narrative about where their suffering and their worldview was embedded in this idea that we were part of this collective struggle for Palestinian statehood, and the sacrifices that we have to make and our suffering makes sense, has meaning in a
Mm,
social way. And so these British psychologists who'd gone down there to help were, amazed by this, like, what everyone likes to call like resilience, whatever, right? I find it resilience is really important. It's just so commodified right now as a term. But the other thing that was really fascinating to me was this Ethan Waters book called Sick Like Us. I think what was it? Watters. He was looking at Indonesia after the tsunami. He was looking at certain countries in Africa which
mm,
had suffered, genocide or a lot of violence, and he saw that wherever these trauma site workers had come in, his interviewees talked about their experiences in terms of the trauma that the Western doctors had told them to talk about their stories in, but where and so their narrative fit into this trauma culture narrative. And a lot of the emergency aid that was sent into Indonesia and into Rwanda, they
mm-hmm.
um, they sent the World Health Organization, Doctors Without Borders sent like trauma packs, which actually, had like female hygiene products and antidepressants.
Wow.
It was like they were just ready to put you on the drugs
Mm-hmm.
and anti-anxiety drugs. And of course, the people were suffering a great deal, but the ways, but it was so marked where he saw like interventions by Western doctors and like aid workers and where there wasn't any. And there were not like great differences in mental health outcomes. But the most fascinating thing for me was his study of schizophrenia in an
Mm-hmm.
African country. I forget now, but there he interviewed and stayed with families. I think it was Mauritius, and he interviewed one family where a schizophrenic young woman lived with her mother and her extended family, and the family just treated it very casually. They were like, "Oh, sometimes she has these episodes, but she has a place in her life." I mean, it's it's really like the burden on the mom was incredible, but she was like taking care of the kids, taking care of her grandmother, and the daughter said, I know sometimes I have these episodes. My mother helps me, but I try to help around the house. And it's like pre-modern, pre-industrial life. Like no one's like going to work 9 to 5, right?
Mm-hmm.
But and so there was an integration of the schizophrenic woman in the family, and he talked about their treatment of her and her mental illness as casual. Like everyone was very casual about it. But where there was another family that had more exposure to the West, they were very anxious about their schizophrenic family member, and kept talking about drugs and treatments and how we had to get her into an institution, and there was a lot of blame and anger, like, and panic, like more reflecting um what we experience how we experienced the onset of youthful schizophrenia and all that, which is terrifying, like, which is a
Mm-hmm.
terrifying experience. But the more like casual integration of the mentally ill person in the social fabric produced like a better outcome, he said, or not worse than high medication and cycling in and out of institutions for this other family, which is what we experience in America, like deep medicalization, medication, cycling in and out of institutions which are basically holding tanks. They don't do
Mm-hmm.
much in terms of treatment. And there was a movement in the 19th century that was um, that was started by the Quakers, and they felt that if there were these people who were mentally ill, but we should treat them with kindness. Once again, it's just like kindness was the um, was the attitude we should take. We should build these institutions for them, and not, electroshock them, bathe them in cold water, do all of these crazy pseudoscientific things that people were doing in the 19th century, and just have like a kindness protocol. And that actually prospered for a long time. You need a lot of state funding, you need church funding, and these institutions got bigger and bigger. And then John F. Kennedy's sister was lobotomized in the 50s. Like one of the Kennedy siblings was schizophrenic. She was institutionalized. She was in one of these giant institutions down in the 50s. And I think it was without the family's consent or something like this, but it was a disastrous lobotomy. And JFK was one who started to close down the big institutions,
Mm.
because and that's where we get like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Nurse Ratched, this idea of an institution as just in a place where people are being abused. But actually, amazingly, many of them were quite humane. Oh, it was called humane treatment of mentally ill. And in the 60s and the 70s especially, everyone's like very anti-institutional, and JFK put in this law that any mental health institution that had more than like 16 beds wasn't going to get any federal government treatment, because
Mm.
he felt his sister had been delivered into this, giant factory, which she probably was in some ways. But you know why? Now what we do, we have on the street treatment of the mentally ill. They closed down
Yeah.
all the big institutions. Instead of reforming them or giving them more money or doubling down on the humane treatment thing, um, one of the other side effects of having lithium be a really powerful game changer in the treatment of schizophrenia was that you could chemically, it was like a chemical straitjacket, so
Mm-hmm.
you could, actually sedate people enough that they were allegedly not a danger to themselves. They're drooling, whatever, but they can be then delivered out into the world, allegedly, which is why we have like almost 1 million homeless people in America. Many of them have serious mental illness. A lot of mentally ill people are in prison right now. But there's a reason why all these, I mean, big institutions were closed down, and it actually started not. People like to blame Ronald Reagan, but it actually started with JFK. So there was a lot of um, suspicion of the medical institutions, and I trace this kind of suspicion of the medical institutions into a medicalization of mental illness, about which we know so little, to find a biological basis for it in the DSM, so that we can have the pair of drugs that will go, that will cure symptoms and cure them by list. People have not found the basis for serious mental illness, PTSD included. I mean, schizophrenia. There's no brain, there's no like biological somatic difference that you can identify and change with a drug intervention. So, like, there's clear symptoms of diabetes, and there are drugs to treat diabetes. Doctors agree on what diabetes is. Within the psychiatric community, there's no clear consensus on the somatic basis of a symptom, and diseases can change all the time based on the checklist. Like, you can have, they used to have, I think, for women, they had this horrible thing that feminists go crazy about. I think it was called like hysterical personality disorder or something. And then suddenly, like, there's a social movement and it's gone. Um, the PTSD
It's
is,
usually to push a certain drug too. It's usually top down big pharma. We have a solution, so we're going to create the problem in the DSM, right? In
yeah,
that particular case, it's one example of many. ADD, here's some meth, some Adderall, or whatever. But sorry.
yeah, no, yeah. It's like, it, and you know what, Americans, I feel like right now we're so vulnerable. Like, we're so hungry for diagnoses. Like, people just are embracing, like, I have ADD, I have OCD, I have this. Like, somehow that makes you visible
Mm.
to the medical establishment. And I think that part of that is also the fraying of our social relations, where we want to have like a scientific definition of our distress, because we have so our relationships with other people, or even with, we're not okay. Like, let me be really, really uh goofy here, but capitalism is very, very cruel, and we live in a cruel world, and there's no space for like kindness as just a general, like, highly held value. Not among the liberals, not about the conservatives, no. And and so we look with in a world that is so cruel, with no kindness or authenticity that seems to be possible. We think that having a doctor tell us that we have a disorder will give us some kind of relief.
And people are suffering and they do want relief, so it's an easy way to keep the movement of this hamster wheel too. And it's one of those things where we don't look at the environmental or cultural or political factors. We look at the individual, and I actually think, which we can get into, I'd like to go into that Vietnam era and the DSM and how things worked out right there. But I am so obsessed and fascinated with this piece of history from the 1950s onward, when
Hmm.
we had the introduction of the CIA, right? And because if you look at it just at a broad stroke, which I've
Hmm.
looked at it deeper than most average people, just because I thought it was interesting, but
Hmm.
Operation Paperclip and Mockingbird, and you look at where we hired all these Nazi scientists and
Hmm. Hmm.
psychologists, and we gained a really deep understanding of what they learned during the war. And they took all that information and developed our Central Intelligence Agency and started doing experimentation on our own citizens, which is
Hmm.
insane. And
Hmm.
there's plenty of
Hmm.
evidence out there to show what they were doing was so nefarious. And they were doing it for a long time until they got caught. And no one would have ever known about it until some things came forth about that. And that piece shouldn't be overlooked because that is directly tied to all of these other elements of, you could call it neoliberalism, or getting into the institutions where they were all a part of. Johns Hopkins, Stanford.
Mhm.
You look at Harvard, a lot of the institutions were being developed at the same exact time with CIA
Oh yeah,
interconnectedness, right?
yeah,
So it's almost
yeah.
like our whole thought patterns were being shaped directly by nefarious psychological manipulation. And
Well,
so it creates this whole monster that we're getting into here.
yeah, I mean, so in terms of like pure ideology, not even just like MK Ultra and stuff like that. No, we don't. Not even to mention MK Ultra,
Mm-hmm.
um, the experimentation of using LSD on soldiers and civilians.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think there was a frenzy of anti-communism in the
Sure.
50s,
Yep.
a frenzy which allowed the CIA to condone the killing of 1 million people in Indonesia, to condone the killing and torture of tens of thousands of people in Chile, for example, all because we were so afraid that communists were going to come and take over America. 3 million civilians were killed in Vietnam because it was a domino effect, and then all of Southeast Asia would be communist. Countries that were dirt poor, like Laos and Cambodia, that had no um, security threat to us at all, were going to be controlled by the Chinese. The Vietnamese and the Chinese Communist parties hated each other. They still kind of do. I mean,
Mm.
it was they wanted sovereignty and a more rational distribution of the wealth of the country after having been exploited by the French for 100 years. Right, the Vietnamese wanted independence, and they had a powerful communist party that almost everyone except for the CIA bootlickers believed in, right? So, in the South Vietnamese, crazy Catholic far right people, but we were able to our whip our own people up into such hatred and ignorance that this campaign, along with the mind control thing that we thought the Chinese were doing the brainwashing. Um, that was what was the impetus behind MK Ultra and Paperclip, was that the CIA thought the Chinese had perfected brainwashing during the Korean War because there were some American soldiers who had defected to North Korea and they didn't want to come home. Usually these were like really, really seriously poor working class people, like young men who are like, I don't want to keep fighting for this country, and here I am a prisoner and people are treating me with dignity. And the Americans were like, oh my God, they're like perfecting brainwashing, because
Mm.
who would want to stay in North Korea or China? They perfected brainwashing. We need to figure out what brainwashing is. Who are
Yeah.
we going to call on to help us figure out what brainwashing is? Former Nazi doctors. I mean,
Right.
we sound like we're crazy, but the whole thing is like it's all out there now. People foil at this. There's that book Poisoner in Chief that came out
Yeah.
a couple
Stephen
years ago.
Kinsner, I interviewed him. Well,
Did
and
you?
what's interesting is that narrative you just said about having the enemy, the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on communists, whatever it is, I think that's the manufacturing component, that's the psyop, because what the CIA learned was that we can get people pitted against whatever the thing is. War on viruses, the next one will be aliens, right? Whatever the thing. And you can have the military industrial complex, which was birthed in that time frame, becomes the machine that's a never-ending profit-making thing if you're always at war. And the only way to get people patriotic is to create the enemy and to get everyone collectively on board and to become feeling like they're okay with whatever the sort of psychopathic move is. And 9/11 was a good example of that. Most people don't want to go there, but it's like Fauci, all these people that are actually running amok and not being held accountable. We have this idea in our heads that we're doing the right thing. We're at war for good reason, and it's very complex and interesting, but I think it's all part of this understanding of the nature of social engineering, and they can get it into the institutions, and now you've got a bunch of mid-30s, usually pretty upper middle class people feeling super righteous about whatever the ideology is that's been presented to them. Even
Well,
the psychedelic movement, which we can get into, all the medicine and the models of like it's the healing agent of our time, and it might be a distraction. All of this could be just self-interested, narcissistically ramped up distraction to keep you from paying attention to what's going on the bigger
well,
scale.
we're making connections with people because we're so paralyzed by our own sense of righteousness, actually. And, for me as a member of the left, I just wonder why we can't focus more on private equity. Private equity is raping the country right now. It's taking apart every business and destroying it. It's moving through healthcare, moving through real estate. And then I'm like, why are we fighting these culture wars? Why are we unable to, be associated with each other and organize around these issues? And I found that, if I raise the socioeconomic, political economic issue against the identity politics people come at me on X. Just this whole thing happened last week with Vivek Chibber's um, podcast on Jacobin audio video.
Mm,
It's a social media thing, but it does speak to what you're talking about. Is this sort of psychopathology? Is that he criticized social justice warriors. He said they're social justice warriors without socialism, right? And
hmm
he was very measured about it, but a little and dismissive. And he said we need to reconfigure the left to fight for socialism and redistribution. And people called him a pedophile. People were like, you don't deserve to be a Marxist. They wanted to like eliminate him from the face of the earth. And then like everyone was like, Catherine, you have to write about this. I was like, I don't want to write about this. I'm like, I got all this other stuff. But because he used the word woke, and I've been talking about trauma culture as kind of the seed of what gives woke and identity politics its apparatus. And I don't use that word woke, so people just, well, they don't pay attention enough, so they kind of ignored me for a while, except people who read more carefully. And then I published something defending Vivek Chibber, but then talking about how he says like ethnic studies programs were started by in after the unrest of the 60s as a kind of grassroots movement. And I was like, actually, no. There was the first ethnic studies programs were started at UC Berkeley, and they were brokered as part of a negotiated settlement with a group of people called the Third World Liberation Front, which was led by Richard Aoki, who was an FBI plant in the Black Panthers. He was the first Asian American, like high ranking officer in the Black Panthers. He gave them arms, and he was interned in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. He's kind of a hero of Asian American studies. But when Seth Rosenfeld was looking into J. Edgar Hoover's surveillance of UC professors, he discovered, as he was FOIAing, the FBI, he discovered that Aoki was actually an FBI informant who had been recruited during the 50s when he fought in the Korean War and was a virulent anti-communist who attracted J. Edgar Hoover's attention because he was
mm,
so anti-communist, and he stayed as an asset for like 20 years. And then Berkeley had the biggest like student strike, and what did they get? They got ethnic studies departments opening. They got to start the first ethnic studies department. Everyone celebrated him as the founder of Asian American studies, and for a long time, people were like, "No, he wasn't an FBI asset." And Rosenfeld put 500 pages of his FOIA up on a blog site, and he was making reports to the FBI. He made many, many reports. Like, here's this person, here's what this person doing, here's what, this person's not so radical, this person's moderate. So if you really wanted to build like a UC for the working class, the FBI stymied it for a multicultural, like racially diverse working class. The FBI actually stymied it by creating a new discipline within the
Mm.
university called ethnic studies. And Chipper's question was, why can't we study the history of minorities within sociology? He's in the sociology department, right? Why
Mm-hmm.
political science, American history? And he kind of like just leaves it out there. So I defended him, but I also wanted to make sure that this part of the history was talked about correctly. Not a lot of people are going to tell you this, but it's all
Sure.
out there. And
Yeah.
then um, somebody screen capped somebody. I went off X the next day because I was like, I don't want to see this. And somebody said, yeah, Amber Frost and Catherine Liu should ordain themselves.
It's amazing. Yeah, and it's unfortunate because we've gotten to the point where I think it's been engineered this way, and it seems obvious more now than
Yeah,
ever, especially with social media. There's obviously it's been
yeah.
proven when you look at Tristan Harris and the people that engineered these social platforms, they're talking about it. They're going to Congress going, we quit our jobs at Facebook and Google because of the way that we were hiring psychologists, sociologists to get everybody divided and angry and outraged, and then
Oh, I don't know
we can
this.
funnel. Oh my God, it's
Tristan
incredible. This
Harris.
guy's brilliant. He actually made a documentary called The Social Dilemma, and
Hmm.
it's all about the engineering of basically this attention economy, which is what we're in, where everybody's trying to capture attention and drive the attention, which is social psychological engineering. And the people that it's tied to go back to the same roots of the CIA. It's not like these are separate. These are all interconnected entities. And if you're trying to drive profit or attention and you're trying to drive social behavior, it gets really interesting. And so for you and I to be able to have a conversation and be kind to each other and be able to disagree, that's the point that we're missing in this culture. We
Yep,
need to have conversations with people that we don't agree with. That's what
yep,
my podcast is for. I like talking to people that have different ideas,
yep.
expose them to myself and others. And then it's instead what people do is they see a title or a headline or they hear a clip or a soundbite, they get outraged, they cancel you, they call you a racist or a
Yep,
whatever the
yep.
keyword is to discredit all
That's
of the
right.
things that you
That's
are.
right. That's
And
right.
so it's about virtue signaling and gaining this social status, and it's been engineered that way because that's
Yeah.
what gets attention.
The whole thing about liberals and liberalism being a mode of active skepticism and tolerance has completely disappeared. The so-called liberals can't stand anyone who might take a skeptical but open-minded idea to their nostra. So they're calling Trump the fascist. There's a new form of authoritarianism that is absolutely intolerant, as I've just found. I knew it was going to happen too, right? Like, that's why I got off X. I was like, okay, I'm going to write this piece. You're like putting thumb screws on me. I think it is time for us to go to war. And you know what? They're going to come after me. They're going to tell me to kill myself. They're going to tell me I'm a Nazi Bolshevik. They're going to tell me that we are all like traitors to the cause. And there are some professors who participated in this too. Here's the other thing that's interesting is that the woke defenders, they'll never go to their crazy followers, their mobs, and go, this is not acceptable. Like, they're
Mm,
getting off on this, you know?
yeah,
And the social engineering part of it is destroying our ability to think and reason and argue. Like, I
yeah,
need to pursue, if I have an idea, I want to persuade you of it. I don't want to
totally.
force you to believe me. But
Yeah,
right now, like, I've heard this from many graduate students in graduate seminars, if they express any kind of skepticism or question, like what decolonialism is or what the latest, um, phrase is, they get shouted down. People are just
absolutely.
screaming at each other. I
Yeah,
mean, this
it
didn't
becomes
happen
an
when I
echo
was in.
chamber.
They're
It's
just
an
like, shut up, you got to shut up.
yeah.
And there was a lot of posing and condescension and authoritarianism when I was in graduate school, but we didn't have these shout fests. Like, I think this is a new thing. And the
Hmm.
person who is shouted at, like, they don't change their minds, but they're intimidated and won't speak up anymore. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, there's a kind of retreat. And I think that's the hollowing out of all like public spaces, is that, you know, if someone really believes in something and they're being shouted down and they're not convinced, then they just like retreat into private life. But we're talking about this kind of like greater sense of isolation, a greater sense of loneliness is all we have, or else they're told like, I have to keep my mouth shut for self-interest, blah, blah, blah. Well, do we live in a totalitarian society where we have to like keep our mouths shut for self-interest? Because that sounds like Nazism to me, and I fucking hate that. I hate being told what I should think or what I shouldn't think. But I'm in a university where we should have academic freedom. And I feel like all of these effects that are coming out of the attention economy and social media are actually changing the nature of what it can be permitted to be discussed in institutions where you're supposed to have freedom. And there's so much fear. I can't tell you how much fear there is
Yeah.
in my world right now. And they want to blame Trump. There's a lot of like bad shit that goes on with Trump, but my like lib colleagues are like, my God, it's the apocalypse. And I'll be like, well, you know what? Like USAID, I fucking hated them. But I can't say that. I'm just like, oh yeah, yeah, it's really bad. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
Well, it's so.
inadvertently, the guy is like actually taking on the national security state. I mean, he wants everything to be a real estate development, but all the liberals have is like the support of these underhanded agencies like USAID, which was instrumental in doing a lot of regime change in different places by promoting different kinds of NGOs and vulnerable and places of unrest in different kinds of countries. And USAID is not an innocent player in foreign
Yeah.
policy.
And there's a lot of just, I guess, when you get beyond looking at individuals like a Donald Trump or a Biden, which is part of the distraction, you look at what it's all tied to underneath. And what's happening is people are ideologically possessed, they're righteous, and they're unable to have discussions with people they disagree with. And that's
Yeah,
the real win if you were to try to really
yeah,
control a
that's
culture. And if
true.
you read Brave New World back in the day, and he had to revise it 10 or 20 years later because he thought, Huxley goes, oh my God, I thought this was going to be hundreds of years in the future. This is happening in our lifetime. And what Soma seems to be is just this idea. He didn't even know we'd have social media. He didn't know what the thing was that the so called authoritarian would use. But I think it's a mixture of things, one being screen time, social media apps that are based on narcissism and self help and all this stuff that keeps you
Mm.
distracted with your own self interest. Meanwhile, the people playing chess are running amok while you guys are infighting about it's like watching WWE wrestling or something. And
So
that
my
seems to be the scapegoating of how they get away with all this stuff is
yeah, I
Soma.
mean, the I would only disagree with you there is that my only disagreement with you is that the elites are not that competent. A lot of the effects are like unforeseen effects and things like that. Like if
Hmm.
you look at it's a lot of it is brute force stuff. It's not very like sophisticated and it's not very refined. I mean, when we when we think about how the power of social media is so oppressive, you think, oh, it's all a conspiracy from the very beginning. But it's like people falling down rabbit holes, or having a channel be the path of least resistance to profit. I
Yeah.
mean, in Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, she shows how Google was really trying to, like, remember when they were like, don't be evil? They were really, really trying not to be evil up to a certain point when their investors in around 2001, 2003, right after the 9/11 and then the first dot-com crash, were like, you
Mm.
guys got to make money. How are you
I
going to
just,
make
and
money?
I've heard different theories where Google and, the owners, the founders, and Facebook have all been tied to the central intelligence agencies from the gate. And it is quite an interesting theory to think. I don't think it's all a grand conspiracy, but I do believe that there's intelligent engineering behind a lot of it. And that's where
Well,
we could,
the internet was developed by DARPANET as
right.
DARPANET, which was part of
Hmm.
the DoD, and there's no way that the internet would have had this kind of fast development without massive government support. At
Hmm.
Champaign-Urbana, at Berkeley, there were a couple of nodes, but I just think like the drive for profit is very improvisational. It's
Yeah,
very opportunistic,
sure. The
and you know
incentives
what?
are there.
But the other thing is, like we don't even, I think the social engineering is a side effect
Mm-hmm.
of just wanting like close contact with people all the time on social media for data collection. The real irony of this is that we're not making good products anymore in America. We're making money off of a fantasy of advertising and data collection. They're Google now just sells your data to advertisers, and then you get like some Google pop-ups when you're on some websites. It's
Well, they
not
are.
even effective. It's not
Yeah.
like, how often do you click through an ad that's targeting you? It's like one big giant shell game, and they're moving money from one place to another. But they feel like, the advertisers feel like they can't not do this, and Google's like, we can't not do this. This is what we have to sell.
Mm,
So we're producing, um the social engineering part is they want to keep you engaged so that you're like, all your clicks are collected, and they're selling like a virtual you to whatever
yeah.
like ad agency that will then broker your data to someone else. But the fact of the matter is, it's not even a widget that necessarily works.
Mm.
Do you see what I'm
Well,
saying? It's like,
yeah.
it's like a shell game that's, it's like a giant con.
Mhm.
Advertising doesn't, like social media, online advertising is how they're making profit right now. And it's not even that great.
Yeah.
What Amazon has done though is they've done cloud computing. So they are providing all of the cloud computing stuff for people so that they can sell things very cheaply. You look at American main streets, they were decimated by, you know, first shopping malls, then big box shops, then Amazon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what you have is a destruction of the small capitalist for like greater and greater accretions of wealth. That to me is the critical aspect of it. And capitalism is opportunistic and not necessarily competent, because they don't need a streamlined, they don't need a good product at this point. They just need to keep the money moving. They need to keep the data moving, and they need to keep you online. And then the social engineering part of it, to me, is like a side effect benefit.
Yeah, I can see a lot of that too. And then if you look at what the power of AI is going to be and is already, the people that are the so-called transhumanists, I'm sure you've heard that term, but the people like the Ray Kurzweils and Elon Musks and the big tech guys who are actually more powerful than most countries at this point because they're tied into this whole incentivization structure. But they're mining your psychological data to a degree that we couldn't wrap our heads around. And when you look at the amount of power you have, when you understand the nature of human consciousness and you plug it into a supercomputer and an AI, and you have this capacity to build something that's exponentially beyond our imagination, able to do and run processing power. What does that look like in the future? I think it gives certain small amounts of people even more leverage to create something that we can't even wrap our head around, like a dystopian future. And it's a religion. It's an interesting
It's already
phenomena where it's like,
here. It's
yeah,
already
it's here.
here. It's here.
I'm
It's here
excited about it
now.
because I'm like, I'm a rational optimist only on the foundational level of like, all right, how did we get here? No one knows. Where do we go? We don't know, but we're here. I'm grateful for the fact that I'm alive and awake and aware. I'm trying
Mm.
to look at it as, okay, how can we impact and maybe keep it from going off the rails while we're here? But you also can't just live in fear and existential crisis from it either. So there has to be a little level of meaning, hope, and maybe have a little bit of an impact, which is why you write, I'm sure.
This is the thing, is that I feel like the creative processes and the very fact of like human autonomy and our ability to create beauty in the world is kind of indestructible, and that's always giving me a lot, like hope. That gives
Mm,
me hope, and it's and the reason why I'm angry is because with all our resources and rational and progress, why are there so many people suffering so much from
right.
deprivation? Like, what we should be doing is give giving everyone the leisure and the freedom to enjoy like technological progress. So when I get real, that's when I get really, really, disturbed by just the irrationality of it all. But when you think about how the working class lived in the 19th century under the heavy industrial revolution, life expectancies were in the 30s,
Right.
and especially for the working class. So now we have people who can live longer, not great, not satisfactory lives compared with these Ray Kurzweils and Elon Musks. But
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the arc of emancipation should still be liberating the largest number of people possible from just like abjection and deprivation and suffering so that we can all thrive.
Mm.
And if you think about my life or your life, I don't know where you come from, but what my parents went through and who they were and who their grandparents were, it is amazing that I can enjoy the life that I can. But the problem is, I still think there's so much um there's still so many things that we need to do for um for humanity, and we can do it, and these motherfuckers are not going to do it on their own. No capitalist has ever given up profit because of the kindness of his heart. And when you think about the violence of the promised revolutions from 1848 to 1896, the only reason why we got an 8-hour work week was because people were afraid. The bosses were afraid of the workers. They had been pushed to the edge, and there was a general sense of like disorder at the end of the 19th century that made the big guns give concessions. Now what do? We have an 8-hour work week or a 40-hour work week, 8-hour work day. It's not really enough for working class people to survive and pay the rent right now. We're kind of regressing with regard
Right.
to the arc of prosperity. You want to see the future? Go to China. It is
Interesting.
insane what kinds of technological progress is taking place there just with high speed rail.
And with that, though,
Transform the whole
comes a lot
country.
of there's never like a perfect utopian system, obviously, because if you go to China, there's also social credit systems and social credit scores being implemented, full surveillance. You're looking at like
There's
the idea that
surveillance, but the social credit score is bullshit. Is bullshit. There's surveillance everywhere because you pay
yeah,
everything on your
I
phone.
mean,
So everything.
I'm going to Shenyang this week on Wednesday,
Oh,
and that's
cool.
for Falun Gong for them to practice something like yoga or movement, and there's people being persecuted for it, and there's all kinds of issues in China that we could get into, but it's everywhere. It's not like one country
Uh,
has it figured
okay,
out.
I'm not. No, it's not. But I'm definitely anti-Falun Gong. I think they're a cult.
Yeah. Well, even if they were a cult, you should be allowed to have your religious freedom and do what you want to do. And if I was, say, to practice yoga and to be thrown in a box for it or to not be allowed to practice it, or, it doesn't matter what you are. And I like freedom at the foundation of the human condition. And, it doesn't mean I should go and hurt anybody else. But if I'm practicing a movement breath practice that doesn't go along with the tyrannical authoritarian leader, that's pretty
Yeah.
crazy, right? And we saw what happened with COVID. And so we could get into all that. But I don't
But
think
you know
any
what?
system's
What
got it figured
happened?
out.
What happened with COVID was there were protests, and the government in 24 hours took down their restrictions. Like they responded. It was crazy. They went way too far, and the people like rebelled. And I feel like the general rebellion, the sense of rebellion in China is still really powerful. There's like a powerful anti-authoritarianism there because people know, like there's so many of them. Like if you
Right.
just all go like I'm not doing this anymore, the government doesn't have any power over you. A lot of rules are negotiable there, and it's a different kind of authoritarianism. It's a
Mm-hmm.
totally different kind of authoritarianism.
Yeah. We'll have
Have
to
you
get
ever been
into
to
that.
China? Have you ever been to China before?
I'd love to go, but no, I haven't.
Oh, okay. So, there's
I've
just
been to
different.
Japan, but
So the thing is that don't believe the hype. Don't believe the propaganda. I just came back in December. My husband was just there. My son is teaching there now. It's a really complicated place. There's a whole different kind of expression of dissent and dissatisfaction
mm,
because the working class is building that country. and the middle class is dependent on them. I'm not saying they're empowered necessarily, but nominally through the government, like the government says, we represent the people.
Mm.
And if you're thinking about individuals and just like liveliness and just um like personality wise, like the Chinese are just amazing. I mean, you don't
Mm.
speak Chinese, it's hard to get to. They're like incredible. They the they'll criticize the government, like they won't go on WeChat. They'll be like, don't do it online, but they'll criticize the government. They'll talk about very, very frankly about their lives. I have very, very close friends there. I have family there. Nobody has ever fucking mentioned the social credit system. And you know what they'll say? They'll say, you have a credit score, right? That credit score follows you everywhere you go, and you can't um, get loans or something like that. I'm like, that's right. What they do have is you get a human resources dossier. So everyone has that. It's attached to your um, ID number. Like Germany has an ID, national ID too. So if you do something really shitty at one job and is and your HR person puts it in your file, that's going to follow you wherever you go.
Yeah.
It's going to be really hard for you to find another job. And if you have a boss who doesn't like you, then you're in trouble because then they'll like put the report in. But a lot of people, how people get around this, they become entrepreneurs. Capitalism still works. Small scale capitalism still works there enough where you can be like, I hate my white collar job. I'm going to do some hustle thing where I'm going to do import export or something like that. Like I'm going to find my way through because the economy is still growing and there's still like room for this kind of like hustle thing sometime. You know, of course, every Chinese parent wants their kid to like go to college, get a white collar job and do well. But once you're in the white collar system, like you have a personnel file that'll follow you wherever you go. That
Yeah.
that is
I can.
that is the thing that's the closest thing to an actual social credit system. And it was started because so many people did start their own businesses and they didn't pay their workers.
Mm.
So they were like, you know what, you're in debt and they're still not paying their workers. But a cab driver I know said he worked construction for a while and the construction bosses often wouldn't pay him. And so he
Yeah.
preferred driving a cab. And he said, I drive this, it's like Chinese Uber. He goes, I drive you, you pay me, I get paid right away because I can't
Mm.
deal with that anymore. Because
Mm-hmm.
there's a level of like cheating that goes on um, there. But, in 1970, my dad's family didn't have electricity, running water, or they lived in a beaten earth house, which probably they had lived in since 1700. And now
Wow.
everyone lives in a high rise, and all my cousins' kids went to college. So they're like
Yeah.
really lovely really lovely young people, just like amazing. And I'm still like stuck there going, oh my God, if I go to my hometown, where am I going to go to the bathroom? Like I haven't caught up with like what kind of progress has been made there.
Yeah.
So I
I'd
feel
love
like,
to. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about. It's such a complex and interesting, huge organism. Every country is, I guess, but China in itself is like its own. You could study it for a lifetime and live there for a lifetime and barely nick the surface, I'm sure. So I definitely am looking at it through a very limited lens. But even the ability to speak online, to say get online right now and to still be able to speak freely is such a big thing that I hope we can maintain at least.
yeah,
I'm a
yeah.
big freedom of speech guy, and I think that if you can't share ideas, you're losing the most fundamental thing that we could ever
No, no, and
lose.
that is a big problem. That is a huge problem. But there are ways in which you can get criticism out there to the government, and the people were like, we don't like lockdowns anymore. And when I was there last year, they were like, they locked down that building in Xinjiang. People burned up there. We're like, no way, we're not doing this anymore. And I was like, okay, all right, I didn't bring that up, but you guys did. Um, it's a it freedom of discussion is such an important quality, but the America right now, the limitations on it in America are something that you and I are obviously thinking about a lot. A lot of people are thinking about that in China, and I personally can't bear the nationalism. That's what I find kind of just very oppressive and kitschy. But I'm amazed by how many good films get made. I'm still amazed by like how much good culture there is. And I wish that, there could be more freedom there. But you know what their excuse is? They're like, we can't do that because Americans are going to come in and fuck things up. We don't want Facebook here. We don't want that. We don't want American social media here.
Yeah.
And
And it's a weird balance because if you want to have a strong country, there's an interesting element where you almost have to keep things certain control factor. And if you want to let things be loosey-goosey, you got Burning Man to the far end where it's just a big mess after 1 week. They can't manage anything. So there's got to be a fine mix. Where is that at? I don't know where the perfect balance of freedom and chaos is. But, it's lucky that we're able to do this right now and to learn from each other and share
yeah.
perspectives. And
Sorry,
that's my
I went
favorite.
on for way too long, but
Oh, it's all good. And I know you got to get going.
yeah, I got to get going. But
Do you mind a brief second and just say, like, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
oh wow, the voice of reason is quiet, but it will not be silenced. So fuck
like
y'all
that.
haters.
I like it. Hey, thanks for your time today. It was fun.
Oh, thank you. All right.
Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.